Once you are a public company, you are an asset of Wall Street. Once it's in the S&P 500, MicroStrategy is a weapon for the proof of weapons network. You ended up with all of these mining companies over in Texas. They all went public. When more and more people are borrowing against their Bitcoin, that's the optimum thing that they're trying to build up. And that is the attack. And most people are falling for it. People talk about the government potentially nationalizing strategy to end up with some Bitcoin. The government's not in charge. Jerome Powell is a frontman. Trump was paid for by the financial industrial complex. At some point, this network is going to dump America and the dollar. They want to reset the chessboard. You're seeing right now the collective West moving into civil unrest because they know they need to move this to a command and control state. Bitcoin is going to be placed at the very, very center of a future and upcoming currency war. And I think we'll witness this cycle during the Trump administration. All you need to do to protect yourself when that event happens is own Bitcoin in self-custody and understand what's coming.
Archie.
With the Trump administration, with a pro-crypto policy, which is building this Orwellian stablecoin nightmare, I believe in a wolf in sheep's clothing, using Bitcoin strategic reserves as a narrative that got people on board to this. You ended up with BlackRock ETF approved. You ended up with banks able to put Bitcoin on their balance sheet and lever them up. You ended up with companies like Cantor Fitzgerald being able to offer fiat currency loans, and they are a primary dealer direct into the Federal Reserve in order to leverage the debt. You ended up with the Trump administration creating this whole stablecoin ecosystem. And you ended up with all of the tools for Wall Street to persuade as many people to own their Bitcoin with them, get as much Bitcoin as possible. All these Bitcoin treasury companies, once you are a public, I know people love Michael Saylor. The way that this scheme works is that once you are a public company, you are an asset of Wall Street. If you've taken billions and billions and billions of dollars from financial terrorists that invest in corporate bonds, you are owned by them. You are an asset of them. That's how it works. If you are a CEO, you work for the board. If you're a board, you work for the shareholders. Who are the shareholders? BlackRock. What about all the Bitcoin mining companies? You ended up with all of these mining companies over in Texas. They all went public. So now you've created essentially the function to take a massive chunk of the Bitcoin ecosystem and control it within the confines of Wall Street. And that is the attack. And most people are falling for it because it's tax efficient. They can't be bothered to figure out self-custody and inheritance. They're idol worshipping these new Bitcoin massacres, that articulate Bitcoin very well to Wall Street. And everyone's excited because the number goes up, not knowing that anybody that falls for this will eventually, just like in 2021, Operation Choke Point 2.0, that was, I believe, an operation to replace these companies with Wall Street, hand over the industry to Wall Street as much as possible, and then create a pro-crypto environment to persuade as many people to own their Bitcoin and with them. And crypto is the tool, fiat is the weapon, and many, many people are falling for it. And now they've got all the tools they need, and I think they'll push through into a bull cycle. And I think it really goes into the wider macro issues of the US government debt, fiat currency, and the wider geopolitical issues as well, because this is entering into the currency war stage now. So Bitcoin is going to be placed at the very, very center of a future and upcoming currency war because the geopolitics are resetting the world. The US is in a macro, major issue with its debt right now. And BlackRock got all of its clients some Bitcoin. They're preparing for this managed transition. And a lot of people are giving their Bitcoin to BlackRock. So they are empowering BlackRock rather than empowering themselves.
So I'm quite sympathetic to the idea that leverage in a system creates instability. But what we saw in the last cycle with leverage that had, margin calls baked into the contracts are quite different to the circumstances and the conditions under which a company like MicroStrategy or Strategy is borrowing. And in some cases, they're like perpetual preferreds. They're well and truly in the driver's seat versus the conditions we saw around a lot of the debt that typically, traders were taking, hedge funds were taking, and a rehypothecation of assets as well. I mean, I see that as being night and day difference, particularly with the long term and the perpetual duration of what Strategy is issuing compared to what hedge funds were dabbling with, which was essentially, just a tinderbox waiting for a spark, and we eventually got that. So can you just compare the two and perhaps illuminate why I'm missing that angle and likening one with the other with respect to instability in the system? Because I don't see that yet.
Yeah, so if you look at Strategy in isolation, then you see a company that looks relatively safe. It started with the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve strategy. It then it's about to approach the point where it's in the S&P 500. Once it's in the S&P 500, it then gets included in ETF and index funds. Once you're in index funds, you get to reallocate everybody's pension over to the fund managers, and you end up the largest shareholder. Once you're the largest shareholder, like BlackRock, you then get a board seat. And once you get a board seat, you are a weapon. MicroStrategy is a weapon for the Proof of Weapons Network, which is their Bitcoin holding company. You then introduce slowly over time more leverage products, i.e. you commit to dividends in fiat currency. Now we're nowhere near the point where this is distressed, but we've had it go from 3.5 times, the value of the Bitcoin to approximately 1.5 times the value of the Bitcoin. Now that looks a bit more like JP Morgan, 1.5 times their book value of their deposits and client assets. So it looks more like a bank in terms of its valuation. It has fiat currency commitments and the ability to continually roll those over time. And its creditors are, the largest asset managers in Wall Street through these different debt instruments. Now you have the strategy as the base. Then you build around it a financial industrial complex, which involves stable coins, so issuing stablecoin loans from people that put their Bitcoin ETF or their Bitcoin around it. You also have Bitcoin treasury companies that can trade at a discount. We just had Nakamoto crash 96% from its original, its high, 50% in one day. Wall Street are masters of leveraging fiat currency in order to do leverage buyouts. And so they can borrow in order to acquire these companies and roll them into other different. So you've got this pipeline that Wall Street always builds up. And it's when you combine all of these different products together, and then you introduce the ability to borrow against your Bitcoin, that you can then do this margin process. And maybe Strategy is the chosen one that ends up with all the Bitcoin. But BlackRock will be the largest shareholder in Strategy. And now you've got this elaborate pool to end up with 1 million, 2 million Bitcoins all held. And that becomes BlackRock's strategy. And they will have their own mutual funds that will also get exposure. They'll also become shareholders in all the different Bitcoin miners. And they'll also potentially, goes into the debates right now. People are discussing whether Core or Knots have been compromised. They're both making accusations at each other to implementations of, software for Bitcoin. Believe me, BlackRock will play in those games if they can. They will try and use their bribery networks or whatever in order to try and compromise, which is why competition is so important there. So I'm not saying they're going to succeed, but they are building a complex, and it will become a tool for the Wall Street side of Bitcoin. And Strategy is most likely the one that will be able to consolidate it. People talk about the government of potentially nationalizing Strategy to end up with some Bitcoin. The government's not in charge. Corporate power is in charge. This is how BlackRock controls most of the companies. And when I say BlackRock, it's BlackRock, it's State Street, it's Vanguard, it's JP Morgan. It's a financial industrial complex. The Goldman Sachs, they create the weapons. The JP Morgans, they issue the debt that determines how they have control over all the executives. Because if you don't play their game, you don't get access to that junk bond debt or that corporate debt. And you have the asset manager that's able to redirect the flow of capital because everyone's given them their money. When you put those players together, you have a network that is able to engineer rates at the Federal Reserve. People think that like Jerome Powell is in charge of the Fed. Jerome Powell is a front man. The Federal Reserve is owned by 12 regional banks, and those 12 regional banks are owned by the private commercial banks, the financial industrial complex. They meet every quarter and tell Jerome Powell what they need to do. Jerome Powell is a front man. He's a patsy for the banks. What about Trump? Trump was paid for by the financial industrial complex. His number one donors was Elon Musk, the technical industrial complex, building these deep state tools, these social credit scores, with companies that were funded by the CIA venture capital arm that get Ministry of Defense, they get Department of Defense technology to play with as long as they give a backdoor to the intelligence agencies. And they get to play these, celebrity entrepreneurs while they're essentially building this different technology. Trump was also the largest funder, was the Bank of New York Mellon family, a key player in the financial industrial complex. And also Mariam Edelstein, an Israel First lobby group. So that's what Trump is. Who is he? He works for the financial industrial complex. So if you've got the Trump administration, which is negotiating all of these deals for the banks, Jerome Powell, that answers to the banks, and the financial industrial complex, which sits on top, that is also deciding which of these companies gain access to the debt capital markets, and they control the Federal Reserve, and they control fiscal policy and treasury. You've got this, these companies that are able to engineer a pump and dump in Bitcoin. And all you need to do to protect yourself when that event happens is own Bitcoin in self-custody and understand what's coming. Because when they want to crash Bitcoin to get your Bitcoin to trigger all the margin calls in Cantor Fitzgerald, and they've got a bunch of managed Bitcoin, and they got the number one shareholder in Strategy, they can combine this financial industrial complex in order to... What they can't do is manipulate the long-term price. The fixed supply is the fixed supply. We're seeing that with gold right now. But they can do elaborate schemes to steal your Bitcoin, put a bunch of companies in Chapter 11, end up dollarizing the Bitcoin like happened in most of the bankruptcies, doing a leverage buyout where they lend to one player in order to acquire others. And it looks like Strategy might be that end player for BlackRock's Bitcoin division, for the Bitcoin that they actually control. And this is not a reflection on Michael Saylor. This is anybody that has a public company that needs access to the debt capital markets in order to pump the price. They are a tool for the financial industrial complex. There is no independence there.
If what you're saying plays out, how can we identify the inflection point, and what are some potential catalysts for that?
I don't think we'll know. But they're going to want to build up as much leverage as possible. I think when more and more people are borrowing against their Bitcoin, that's the optimum thing that they're trying to build up. So I keep an eye on Cantor Fitzgerald. I keep an eye on World Liberty Financial. I keep an eye on what's happening with the stable coins. I keep an eye on Palantir and the manipulations that are happening through artificial intelligence. I keep an eye on all of that. And then if you think about what was the trigger of 2021, well, it was the macro and geopolitical environment that all kind of triggered together. You had the inflation is transitory. You had the escalation of the Ukrainian and Russian war that led to spike in oil prices, that led to an inflationary cycle, that led to manipulation of rates. We've seen the Federal Reserve ever since 1913 engage in probably 20 of these pump and dump cycles. Like, you can find them. Like, just look through the whole history of the Federal Reserve, 20 pump and dump cycles that they've done in order to end up with where Wall Street and the wealthy control 90% of the stock market to 10% of the network. So when you're at the maximum leverage point, and you're at the point where Bitcoin needs to be weaponized in a geopolitical play, i.e., at some point, this network is going to dump America and the dollar. At the moment, they make a lot of money out of controlling the dollar. Eventually, the dollar is going to be useless to them, and they want to change. They want to reset the chessboard and really transition us deeply into this multipolar world. And they'll be utilizing both, I think, Bitcoin as a negotiation and foreign currencies to price other products. You'll see oil being priced. It used to be, the petrodollar used to be 100% dollars, now it's 70% dollars. If that starts coming down to 50%, you're seeing, this resetting of the chessboard. And I think you're seeing right now the collective West moving into civil unrest, because they know that they need to move this to, a command and control state. The tactics of this network that have historically been done on the global South, on Asia, on the Middle East, they're coming home now. That's really clear, because the dollar doesn't have as much influence with the rise of China and various other things. So the geopolitics, then you get the macro, and the macro is what's happening right now. Well, Trump is doing fiscal dominance as a strategy. Fiscal dominance means that they are increasing the debt, and they are inflating away the debt, and they're going to create an ultra inflationary cycle. So the price of everything's going to go up. Tariffs were a tax on the American corporation. Inflation, when they put their prices up, that's a tax on the American consumer. So they make it look like they're doing something else, but they're actually just getting a bunch of tax. And then they're saying, well, we're paying down our debt. No, you're not. They increase the debt ceiling. The government shutdown happened today. They increased the debt ceiling to $5 trillion. What are they doing? What was the big, beautiful bill that Trump announced? A bunch of money for Palantir, a bunch of money for Lockheed Martin, a bunch of money for General Dynamic, a deregulation environment for artificial intelligence, a bunch of money to Oracle. These intelligence funded operations that rely upon Pentagon budgets. They are ramping up the Pentagon budgets. So you have a fiscal dominance, which means the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. It's that K-shaped economy where those that are deep in debt, they're just trying to survive, and the others are leveraging debt in order to accumulate more assets. So once you have that geopolitical situation, plus you have the macro situation, then I think Bitcoin becomes the perfect tool to engineer some kind of pump and dump cycle that resets the chessboard. And I think we'll know about it. It will look like a very sophisticated version of what we saw in 2021 and 2022 with these Celsius. That was the playground. That was the beta test. Now they're setting up the big game. And the big game is going to be a big reset of the chessboard. And I think Bitcoin is a tool that they can use. And that's why all the central banks are buying gold right now. Gold is at all-time highs. People outside of America cannot get enough gold in exchange for their dollar reserves. And the only countries that are still lending to the US government are the ones that the proof of weapons network controls. The UK, we're just fully vassalized and controlled by, Keir Starmer might as well work for BlackRock and Lockheed Martin and JP Morgan. Like, he might as well sit in that office. He ain't working for the people. He's just printing money and sending it to those companies. And and Japan. Now, Japan's actually pivoting. This is a post-World War II country that is the largest lender and purchaser of US bonds. They're pivoting now. They're turning east from west. And so when you have the two largest countries that are propping up this debt-based Ponzi scheme, then all of a sudden the bag holders of the dollar are the American people. And that's why Cayman Island is the largest lender to the US government right now, because that is BlackRock, that is JP Morgan, that is all those different funds. And that's what stablecoins are for. Genius Act was a way of turning the Federal Reserve's balances that the bank had into stablecoins, creating a shadow central bank digital currency for JP Morgan, and allowing players like the Trump family, and Elon and various other players to have their stablecoin. This is all being built up, and I think we'll witness this cycle during the Trump administration.